Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week video. This is episode number 236, and today we'll be running across the river as Howling Furies with a Fistful of Metal. That's right, it's the debut album for Anthrax, originally released on January 6th, 1984 via Megaforce Records. So, without further ado, let's begin. Now, the beginnings for this band is quite muddy these days. Just go ask Greg Walls and trust me, his name will be popping up sporadically throughout.
I was the first lead guitar player in Anthrax.
But nonetheless, I won't completely bore you with the history details. All you need to know is that Anthrax was formed in 1981. Now, there were lineup rotations between the years 1982 and 1983. At one point in time, John Connolly was once the singer of Anthrax, but only lasted till like 1982. Eventually, after going through various bass players, Dan Lilker decided to switch from lead guitar to bass, but that probably would be wrong according to Greg Walls. At least the time dates, that is. Connolly would soon be replaced by Dirk Kennedy of the band Hitman, but he as well would only last for a small time before they would finally settle with their schoolmate Neil Turbin. With the lineup of Turbin on vocals, Walls on lead guitar, Scott Ian on rhythm guitar, Lilker on bass, and Greg D'Angelo on drums, they would go on to record a 5-song demo that would feature the tracks Across the River / Howling Furies, Hate, Pestilence, and Satan's Wheels. This would turn out to be the only release with this lineup of the band, as things would change. After playing some gigs with Metallica in the spring of 1983, by the summer after issues between Walls and Ian taking place, he would be gone, leaving the band without a lead guitar player. According to the stories, Neil Turbin seriously felt like leaving because of what had just transpired. But the late former Riot singer Rhett Forrester talked him out of it and suggested a guy named Bob Berry to replace Greg Walls. Bob Berry's time in Anthrax was short-lived, as they would finally land with Dan Spitz, who was just coming off from being an Overkill. Yes, that Overkill, folks. Greg D'Angelo would eventually leave the band after recording another 5-track demo that eventually gets the attention of both John and Marcia Zazula, to which they would finally be signed to Megaforce. Charlie Benante would soon place D'Angelo, and practically the rest is history. After getting signed to Megaforce, the label would soon release a 7-inch single that would contain the tracks Soldiers of Metal and Howling Furies, which was produced by the former The Dictators, Shakin' Street, and Man-O-War guitarist Ross the Boss. Strangely enough, the Howling Furies track for this 7-inch 45 would be the only recording with Greg D'Angelo to get officially released domestically to the public. Now, it was during the later months of 1983 where the recordings for their full-length album would take place, being recorded at Pyramid Sound, located in Ithaca, New York. Now, while the single was produced by Ross the Boss, for the full-length album, the Rods drummer Carl Kennedy, who had a great relationship with the Zazulas, was brought in to produce the full-length album. But besides Kennedy, Alex Perialis was also brought in to engineer the recordings. Once the album was mastered by Jack Skinner, it would finally be released on January 6th, 1984, with the gruesomely insane cover art that was done by Kent Joseph, or is it Josephi, over at Cheryl Studios. So, featuring 10 tracks, clocking in at the length of 35 minutes and 36 seconds, these 10 tracks are, well, kicking off with Death Rider, Metal Thrashing Mad, I'm 18, yes, that I'm 18, Panic, Subjugator, Soldiers of Metal, Death from Above, the eponymous band title track, yes, Anthrax, then Across the River, and finally ending with Howling Furies. So there you go, folks. There's your 10 tracks. Now, back in very late 2002, I was exposed to a very popular video game at the time, and in a way it still is considered a very nostalgic for a lot of video gamers, but it was none other than Grand Theft Auto Vice City. Now, as part of this video game's soundtrack, since most of this was all based around the 1980s, well, they of course had to have a radio station that focused on a lot of the heavy metal, hard rock of that time period, especially when even throwing in a couple thrash metal bands. One of those thrash metal bands was Anthrax, and it was the song Madhouse. So this was how I got exposed to Anthrax at a very young age. Let's put it that way, it's a very young age. And this is now the second video where I'm now name dropping Vice City for the game, because the last one was Defenders of the Faith for Judas Priest and all that. Well, I fell in love with this song. Let's put it that way. I fell in love with the song Madhouse, and I thought it just had a great, even though it was very heavy, but at the same time, just like with even like Megadeth's, the song Peace Sells, it has a hook, and it was just something that it easily grabbed me. But the difference that I kind of found with an Anthrax was that the vocals were more melodic than a lot of your usual sort of thrash metal singers at the time, which is a more barking sort of delivery, but his was way more melodic, and especially Joey Belladonna just had these very smooth sort of vocal deliveries. But it was just those that just drew me to the band in general, but I wouldn't end up hearing anything from this band until much later, and that's what brings me to Fistful of Metal. Well, the first thing that my brother ended up buying physically was not Spreading the Disease. Instead, it ended up being Fistful of Metal. But the one that he bought was that sort of compilation where it included Fistful of Metal, the Soldiers of Metal 7-inch single, and of course, the Armed and Dangerous EP. I'm going to be really honest with you. Probably for a lot of other people that probably, let's say, discovered Anthrax in a much later period, especially when they were getting young. And let's say if you had discovered this band around the John Bush era, and especially by the time I did, John Bush was already the singer for the band. But you get the point there. Obviously, when you go backwards, Fistful of Metal, of course, has a bit of a different feel to it. The atmosphere just feels different, and the tone is a lot more different. Let's just put it that way. And it doesn't really have the sort of very smoothness of Spreading the Disease had, even though both of them are almost similar. But Spreading the Disease felt more realized, whereas this one felt more like a band trying to find its footing. And that's the way that I felt when I first heard Fistful of Metal. So because of that, and also hearing Neil Turbin's voice for the first time, it just wasn't the same smooth sort of delivery that Joey Belladonna had. And so it's one of those reasons that it took me a bit of a while for me to kind of grow into Fistful of Metal. But once I finally was able to wrap my head around a Fistful of Metal and even the Soldiers of Metal 7-inch, boy, did I really grow into the sound. And this is why I finally am able to now get in front of this camera for this episode to elaborate why I absolutely adore Fistful of Metal. What I used to not like about this album eventually became what I loved about this album. While the album may have an aggressive tone to it, but it's not in your typical polka thrash that would begin to be felt on Spreading the Disease. Instead, this is more closer to traditional speed metal that is inspired by the new wave of British heavy metal and even early New York metal like Twisted Sister, Riot, Manowar, and The Rods, with Neil Turbin possessing more of a lower voice tone with him singing like your typical metal vocalist, reminded me more of an Eric Adams of Manowar. Hell, Anthrax on this album does sound like if Manowar, if they were given a lethal dose of epinephrine. That's an adrenal injection, kids. I mean, just from songs like Death Rider and Panic, which are just speed metal defined, with those sharp licks and high-octane adrenaline, with the band playing like there is no tomorrow. But the thing that carries this album is the conviction that I feel the band emanates. To me, that is just felt more on the tracks like Metal Thrashing Mad, Subjugator, Soldiers of Metal, Death from Above, and the 1-2 punch of Across the River and Howling Furies. While there is a franticness to these tracks, the pacing for these songs are varied, ranging from mid-pace to galloping, but all equally possesses an intensity that guides these songs. Hell, you can't help but hear those new wave or British heavy metal influences in an instrumental like Across the River. There is even an Iron Maiden-like dual guitar lick in the middle that easily reminds me of either tracks like Genghis Khan or Transylvania, which was probably the point, given that Scott Ian has always found ways to display his love for that band. Of course, I can't forget about the eponymous band title track, starting off rather fast before switching gears to something that kind of reminds me of Manowar's eponymous band title track, off of, well, the Battle Hymns album, their debut. It has that traditional classic heavy metal component that gives it its personality. I think the only song here that I feel is completely out of place is the cover of Alice Cooper's I'm 18. Now, I'm an Alice Cooper fan, but for some reason, his songs never truly translated well when other bands performed his material. Only a select rare few have gotten him right. But clearly, Anthrax didn't get to be included on that select list. But yet, even besides a rather lame cover track, this album still rules. Now, I know that former member Greg Walls has claimed that he wrote Metal Thrashing Mad and Panic, and going as far as claiming that he helped write 7 other songs, besides even claiming that he was the foundation for Anthrax. I mean, he did perform on the first recordings of Across the River and Howling Furies. Now, I'm not going to deny Greg Walls' side of things, because really, sadly, I'll just be displaying a glorified opinion. But more power to him to feel that he was ripped off by Scott Ian. So at the end of the day, no matter what the personal conflicts are, it doesn't change the fact that Fistful of Metal is a badass debut album. So again, I'm not here to fact check Greg Walls and his side of the history because that's between him and Scott Ian. But I will be here to be voicing my opinion of why I truly feel that this has the shittiest mastering job across every single CD release. So, in the immortal words of the late, great Owen Hart, enough is enough, and it's time for a change. Why is it this album is the only Anthrax album, let alone Carl Kennedy produced album, that has one of the worst mastering jobs across every single CD release? I've seen plenty of people blame it on Carl Kennedy for it, but I disagree, because most of the albums he's ever worked with, either it be his band stuff or Possessed Beyond the Gates, which have sounded quite fine on CD, but yet for some reason it's Fistful of Metal that has sounded like complete ass. So the question is, who's the culprit? That, sir, if you had previously paid attention to the word mastering, then I believe the answers that we are seeking out for are right there in front of us. I truly believe that the issues for this album sounding like crap is all due to who has mastered the tracks for physical release in the past, which is something that completely ends up out of the producer's hand. So from guys like Jack Skinner to all the way over to the others who have had remastered this album for CD, I mean, look no further than that really bad Megaforce repress of both Armed and Dangerous, Fistful of Metal, and even the Soldiers of Metal 7-inch 45 single from, was it 2005 or so? Oh, ew, that is the most disgusting sounding CD copy I've ever heard. Are the ones you should be pointing at. So with this album now being 40 years old, maybe it's also time that this album finally gets a much needed proper reissue with the best sound restoration. If I have to suggest anyone to any of the band members or anyone who might, let's say, hypothetically could be involved with a possible reissue of this classic debut album, and if any of the band members, let's say either Scott Ian or Charlie Benante or any else from Anthrax, I would probably, let's say, stumble upon this video, may I suggest you this guy, who I feel would be the best guy, or the right guy, for that matter, for the job to restore the sound mastering, the sound quality for this album. And that's none other than Patrick W. Angle, who these days has been the go-to guy for a lot of these boutique reissue labels to basically work on the remastering or the sound restoration for a lot of their reissues. And I got some examples for you. Okay, for example, the sound here from Buzzer. This was a very obscure sort of Belgian metal band, but this has been the first time here, again, through Dying Vintage Productions, that finally was able to be given a CD release. And Patrick W. Angle, again, he did the mastering job for this CD, and again, it's this great sound quality. So from Buzzard's only album, Gambler, to even Faithful Breath's Skull here, a great sort of sound quality on this one. Again, this was originally done for High Roller, but this is the classic metal copy for the label. But he also worked on even the one previous to this one, which is Golden Glory, and hell, he was given the opportunity to actually work on the sound restoration for the first two Quiet Riot albums. Again, the ones with Randy Rhoads, and these were approved by both the Benally estate and even the Randy Rhoads estate. They approved these two reissues for No Remorse Records, and he was one who was given the opportunity to restore the sound quality for a lot of these albums, to do the mastering for them, and they just sound fantastic to begin with. And so this is enough reason why you probably should be looking at Patrick W. Angle for actually doing a good, proper sound restoration, sound mastering, and everything for Fistful of Metal. And then, of course, on top of that, I'll throw in some bonuses. He helped with the restoration for this album here from a very obscure band, Mad Butcher with Metal Meat. Again, he only helped with the restoration of the sound, but not so much the remastering, but he helped with it. This was for Storm Spell Records out of California here. And of course, the only album in my collection right now that he actually produced was the debut album for the Swedish metal band Ambush. This is Firestorm. So this is all the reasons why you probably should look at Patrick W. Angle if you're gonna at least want to do Fistful of Metal some good, needed justice. So there we have it, folks. There it is. If you're one of those who were there from day one when this album broke as a brand new release, you know what to do. But if you had discovered this album around the time, let's say, when Belladonna was in the band, or maybe possibly John Bush, and you went backwards to then stumble upon this album, their debut, if you have any thoughts, whether they were positive or negative, you can leave them all in the comments section below. But if, let's say, it has yet to grow into you, if you have yet to grow into this album, it has yet to click with you, may I suggest that you give this album a re-listen, because I think this is definitely worthy of anyone's attention. I think this is a very solid speed metal record, very classic metal for that matter. This is just a old school US metal record and should be looked as such, as a old school US metal record, and not try and look into the same sort of eyes, let's say, of the later Anthrax sounds. It's definitely its own feel, and I think it needs to be taken as that. So that's what I recommend. But with that, still, I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. This is Harry Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.